In what way is Ledger different from your previous books, if it is indeed different?
Well, all of my books, all of my work has been an evolution over time with some continuity and some large changes. I would say the greatest change of Ledger is the extent to which it is a book looking at public issues. I've always done that in my work. Every one of my books has poems looking at issues of war and peace, looking at issues of the environment, goes far back in my work. But this book, its center of gravity are questions of the crisis of the biosphere, the crisis of climate change, also the crises of social justice. And it is a book, like all of my books, which reflects the time in which it was written. What I have cared about during the time in which it's written is what goes into my poems. And these great crises of the earth and of our human compact with one another have stepped forward. There's also personal work in the book, but that is the largest shift. It's called Ledger because it is an attempt to take account of things I found unaccountable and unfathomable and grievous. And I needed to be examining my relationship to these things. It is a book with greater activism than my earlier books have had, and it is a book of large grief.
Thank you. You've answered a couple of my questions, or almost, but one of them was that I had observed as reading Ledger that there were many poems that had lines that included like little mini lists or repetitive lists of things or objects. And they're kind of in the nature of a ledger where you're putting items down on paper for an accounting. And then other poems had to do with actually counting things or like Ledger or My Debt. And I just wanted to find out what your thoughts were about when you chose the title for the collection. And did you have a sense that that was the thread going through it as you were writing them, or did that only come to you after you looked at the manuscript and decided this is what I've been doing?
So threads appear in one's life because there are things you're concerned about, and there are also craft things that begin to magnetize the coming into being of poems. I always title my books at the end. I never have an advance idea that I am setting out to write about a particular set of subjects or in a particular way. And usually titling my books is quite difficult and painful. And this book, what happened was my editor at Knopf wanted to know where things stood. And I said, oh no, I'm very, very far from a book. And she said, send me your loose poems anyhow, I'm just curious. And so I gathered all the loose poems, which I'd already in a way done because a selected poems was coming out in Poland, and I wanted to give them the newer work that I felt was solid to include. And after I emailed these poems off to my editor, and before she answered, the thought just crossed my mind, Ledger, that might make a good title for this book, whenever it happens, whenever it's ready. And when she emailed me back, her email said, you know, I think Ledger would be a really good title for this book. And so, you know, the title poem had been written, and the poems with, you know, accounting in them and the attempt to take account in them had been written. But I try in a way not to see the through line until very late in the process, because I don't want to constrain what poems might arrive in my pen and at my desk. I don't want to have an idea of what I mean to be doing, because I want to be permeable to what needs to arrive. And so only after I saw that did some of the poems magnetize to the title and the idea that I was now conscious of. So the final poem in the book, which you mentioned, the poem My Debt, that was written after I knew what the book was. But the title poem, Ledger, was written before I knew what the book was. I write one poem at a time. I don't write books. Other poets sometimes write books. They can be absolutely splendid. It isn't my own process.
Thank you. You brought up the issue of writing about injustice and tragedy, and that's one of the many things going on in Ledger. And you asked some questions, I think, in some of the poems about accountability for those who are witnessing the tragedy. In Cataclysm, you have a line, "The fed consider the hungry and stay silent." So do you think that failing to act is due to our inability as an individual to address something so large? Or is it something that we do out of either apathy or fear that we need to be held accountable for? I felt like some of the poems were holding us gently accountable, but I wanted to get your take on it.
So the person who I would be holding accountable first is always myself. I don't believe in writing poems attacking other people for their failures. I want to investigate my own sense of helplessness, my own sense of not knowing what to do, my own sense of, any time I walk by a hungry person in the street and don't give them something, what am I doing? Is it, so often it is, I try both. It is interesting and odd in that I have in a much earlier book, a poem called Judgment, an Assay, which is an investigation of judgment. And I have a very mixed relationship to judgment because there is a large part of me which dislikes it entirely, and which feels like a proper relationship to existence is to take in what is, to acknowledge what is, to not argue with what is. I also certainly believe that the correct relationship to both myself, but also my fellow human beings, is one of compassion, not one of condemnation. So I hope the poems, even though they hold to account, are not heard as a harangue, because nobody responds to a harangue anyhow. The work of poetry is the conjuring of empathy. Empathy for all beings, human and beyond human. Understanding our interconnection is built into the craft of poetry, the techniques of poetry. Every time you write a metaphor, including a mountain, you are taking something of the mountainous into your own psyche and body, your memory of walking a mountain trail, your vision of a mountain. There's one out my window every morning when I wake up. And so, yes, it is a book of holding into account, but I hope it is not a book of harangue or anger, except to the extent that I include myself in it. The first poem in the book, Let Not Say, was a poem that I wrote. It was probably the earliest written, as well as the opening poem in the book. And it's a poem in which I imagined the future judging our generation, our time, what we did or didn't do to save the earth from the course that it is careening towards just now. And that poem, the first audience for it was myself. Let them not say we did not see it, we saw. Let them not say we did not hear it, we heard. And after I wrote it, I became myself. I'd always been somewhat of an activist. I became more of an activist because I had to live up to my own poem.
So I definitely think there's nothing of the harangue about any of the poems. And
Thank you.
as a reader, I use that term gentle accountability because that's what I felt like it was, that as you were talking about your own or the speaker's feeling about the things that were being witnessed, it made me then witness those myself and think, what am I doing, and why am I not feeding those who are hungry? So
that response gladdens and relieves me.
good, good. If you don't mind, I have a couple of more general questions that are not about Ledger, but about your entire body of work or about your way of working. And one of them is, I read an essay that you wrote called The Question of Originality. And there was a line in there that really struck me. It said, originality requires the aptitude for exile. And it just rang a bell for me. And I thought, how does one develop that aptitude? I mean, it seems like it may be something some people are born with an aptitude for that, but how does one develop it?
That's a wonderful question. Thank you. And, you know, exile, of course, in our usual way of thinking about it, it is something forced upon a person. And one way to develop an aptitude for it is one follows one's life. But for writers and the context of that particular essay, I think the key to developing this quality in one's work and in oneself is to develop a kind of fearlessness. You know, poets, like any other human being, it is difficult to stand aside from the crowd, the group, the conventional way of saying something. If you go out on a limb, you might be misunderstood, you might be condemned, you might be laughed at. Terribly painful things for any mammal. Mammals need a good relationship with their group of peers, or they are at risk of death. It is terrifying to stand aside from the group and take the risk of being different. And yet, you know, one of the cliches of great wisdom in American culture is Thoreau's, "You must learn to march to a different drummer." And I think not only to develop the qualities of originality, of language and thought, which are the only thing that makes any poem or any book worth reading, any play worth watching, any song worth hearing, is that there is new news within it. But also simply to develop a ripened psyche as a human being, we must somehow learn the courage of exposing our own selves, our own opinions, our own perceptions. Authenticity, authority, and author all share a taproot syllable. And this is the courage to see with your own eyes. And when we see with our own eyes, sometimes what we see is the emperor has no clothes, and somebody has to see it, and somebody has to say it. And so certain of my poems, they have frightened me. They have frightened me to say, even to myself, let alone out in public. And I have had to learn a different relationship to my own fear and trembling, and just go, you know, what is it worth if you take no risk in your life? What is a life without risk? Boring, sleepy, tepid, complacent, and not your own. Everyone's life is not one's own life. Now, how do you develop courage? Tiny step by tiny step, breath by breath, experiment by experiment. Some people are lucky, they're born with it. Others of us have to make our way towards it because we have come through some experience to recognize that the terrifying is what we want. You know, the great poet Rilke, a famous line, "Every angel is terrifying." What he is saying is, if you want to experience the great messages that are possible to our human lives, the angels, however one wants to understand that, you have to be willing to be terrified, because the grand is larger than we are. And I have come over the course of my life to want exposure more than I want safety.
Wow, that's a wonderful way to describe it. Thank you. Thank you. In sort of in the same vein as far as writing process, is writing poetry work for you, or is it something else?
Oh, it is something else. Although it is work, it is so much more than that. It is the work which is such a joy to do. You know, again, a person wants engagement in their life. And for me, to write a poem is never an obligation. I can't, in fact, write on willpower. I am a very bad example to my fellow writers. Sometimes it feels as though every other writer in America is writing a poem every day, and I am not. Because if I try to write a poem out of a sense of dutiful labor, it is so bad that, as Emily Dickinson once said, it would embarrass my dog. And my dog has been dead for some decades now, and it would be a shame to embarrass her. And so for me, to make a poem is a way to experience my own life with greater intensity, authenticity, depth, saturation of both emotion and intellect. You know, heart, mind, and spirit are all part of what makes a poem worth writing. And for me, this is the access gate. It is the entrance to understanding my life in fuller, deeper, more complexly nuanced, subtler, less certain ways. It is the gate to a different kind of knowledge and a different kind of feeling for me. And again, not all poets are the same. People write in many different energies and many different intentions. My intention since childhood has simply been to find my way to a deeper understanding of my own life and the life of all beings around me. Poems provided that.
Do poems then in some way also give you a way of participating in something larger than yourself? Do you feel like you're part of a greater poetic universe in some way?
Oh yes, very, very much so. A poem expands the vocabulary of existence for a person, and then if it's a good poem, perhaps for a culture. And so it is like you've lived in a room with one window and suddenly there are 12 windows on every side. Life is more visible, more larger, more feelable, and our ability to see things for what they are is expanded, and the multiplicity is as much of it, the largeness and also the multiplicity. The opening sentence of the essay book, Nine Gates, that the originality essay is in, is poetry is the magnification and clarification of existence. And for me, that is what I want. I want to be more bewildered, because if you are not more bewildered, you will never find your way to larger answers to your questions. And so a poem for me, it's never the expression of an answer, it's the investigation of a question of some kind.